Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Peace, mercy, and blessings of God be upon you. This is a new presentation from www.central-mosque.com and the Humble Heart YouTube channel. It is the 33rd episode of the Making Sense series. You must be perplexed, disturbed, particularly the Muslims during the blessed month of Ramadan, as to what is going on in Sudan affecting Muslims while they're fasting. What is the conflict? What is the history? In this presentation, I will try to attempt to explain a very, very complex situation which goes back centuries. Why did Sudan get to where it is today? If you don't understand how it got there, it will be very difficult to try to solve these issues. So let me try my best to explain this, and it is complex. I am going to try my best. Inshallah, let's begin. But before we do that, I request everyone, particularly the Muslims, during this blessed month of Ramadan, to make dua, to pray to Allah Ta'ala to bring peace, prosperity, and security to this beautiful country and the beautiful people of Sudan. MashaAllah, they're beautiful people. May Allah Ta'ala ease their pain and suffering, which they've been suffering for decades. This isn't anything new. This has just come to light because it's so sudden in the last few days. Let's begin. I'm not going to take you back to hundreds of years, 1,000 years. I'm just going to start this from the 14th, 15th century. So Sudan was ruled by the Funj Sultanate or Blue Sultanate because it's a Sudanese or Arab custom of that era to refer to the people, the black people, as blue. So it was called Al-Sultanatu Zarqa, or the Blue Sultanate. So basically this Funj Sultanate, it predates the arrival of Islam in Sudan. But what then happened is the Sufis, the branch of Muslims who practice tasawwuf, the Sufis, they started spreading Islam into this area. This is pretty much what modern Sudan looks like even today. So Islam started spreading in these lands, and as a result, the rulers of the Fulj Sultanate, they outwardly accepted Islam. So they, because of what was going on in their territory, they accepted Islam. However, it wasn't a practicing Islamic state as such. They still combined rituals of Coptic Christianity, which they followed before Islam, and just to show people that they basically they are Muslims. On the other side of it, particularly in Egypt, the Ottomans, the Ottoman Empire, which was Muslim, Sunni, they wanted to also gain foothold in Sudan over the Funj Sultanate. The reason being is, and this is true to this day, this land of Sudan, it provides access to the Red Sea, it provides access to the Nile, it has oil reserves, it has other minerals and resources. So this was a tussle between the Ottomans and the Funj Sultanate, which later on ended with the Ottoman Empire taking over Egypt previously, over 100 or so years ago, and then from there exerting control into Sudan. So the Ottomans appointed Ismail Pasha from 1863 to 1879, and he looked after the affairs of Sudan. And he called himself a Khadim of the people of Sudan. So although he ruled from Egypt, but he looked after areas of Sudan. Under his leadership, there was many reforms done in Sudan, some very key infrastructure projects, and also the Ottomans genuinely tried to improve the lives of the common people of Sudan. This is Ismail Pasha. But what happened is, at this time, there's decline going on in the Ottoman Empire, and the European powers, or the colonial powers, or the great powers, whatever you want to call them, they are sowing seeds of rebellion against the Ottoman Empire. And one key area where they saw was Egypt and Sudan. Again, Egypt, because British wanted control of the which later became the area of Suez Canal, the Nile and the Red Sea, and also Russia and France and other colonial powers. And what the great powers did is they overthrew Ismail Pasha and they put in his place his son Tawfiq Pasha, which is this guy right here. So Unlike his father, he was corrupt, lazy, and mismanagement which affected parts of Egypt and particularly Sudan. Now, all of a sudden, people who had stability, a little bit of stability in their life, they had infrastructure around them, people's lives were thrown out of balance. And what happened is Al-Turabi, rahimahullah ta'ala, this guy, he saw the suffering of the people. He was originally a poet. He also was, had learned Sharia a little bit, but originally he was a poet. And what he did is he saw the suffering of the people and he started rebellion or speaking out against Tawfiq Pasha. And because of his corruption, laziness, mismanagement of the people, and the people were suffering and that sort of stuff. For the first time in the history of this area, what the colonial powers did is, and there's evidence for that, they actually funded certain factions in the society, and it resulted in anti-Christian riots in the port of Alexandria. So Egypt back then, and even to this day, has Christian populations living alongside Muslims. And because when these anti-Christian riots happened, for whatever reason, the history is murky as to what was the actual flashpoint. Britain and France decided that they need to intervene on behalf of their Christian brothers in Egypt. And this then carried on for almost, 80, 90 years, where the British tried to turn Egypt into British Egypt. And they said that, we will go and we will bomb Alexandria, we will do whatever. Originally, that was the reason the uprising was to actually save the Christians from Muslim oppression. And then once the British were safely established in Egypt after a series of wars, Sudan was by this time corrupt, mismanagement, a complete and absolute basket case. So what then happened in Sudan? The Muslims of Sudan was so disenfranchised and things were changing so badly and rapidly for them. There's a concept in Islam that many Muslims know, that Muslims' lives, when they, whenever things suffer, the Muslims always think about, Allah will send Mahdi to basically reform and basically give rise to Islam, and their lives will be back to normal, peaceful. There was this person his name was Muhammad Ahmad ibn Abdullah in Sudan. Originally, he was a Sufi scholar, but what he did, he's declared himself Mahdi for the people. So, imagine, this is in the 1800s, people are suffering, there's no mass communication, people are just looking for some kind of savior, some kind of messiah, and this guy presented himself as such. His adherents and his followers still exist to some degree in Sudan to this day. Obviously, he was not Mahdi, he was born in a part of Sudan, etc. And at that time, there was a lot of scholars who denounced this. For example, the Mufti Ahmad al-Azhari, then after his passing away, Mufti Shakir, then Sheikh al-Amin al-Darir. So there are writings to this day that exist, letters which they wrote to him, inviting him back to Islam, and also to the population to say that, look, he is not Mahdi. This is a false claimant. Now, picture, if you come from the Indian Pakistani background, picture what is happening in India, Pakistan, about 20 years from this period. Mirza Ghulam Muhammad Qadiani, the same thing, claims to be Mahdi. The scholars of that time denounce him because it takes the attention of the scholars away from what's happening to the people to the theological aspects of what's happening. Basically, some guy is claiming to be Mahdi, etc. Once again, just like in India, Pakistan, there were scholars who muddied the waters, who said, no, he's not a Mahdi, he's actually a reformer, you're misunderstanding this. So this back and forth fight is going on while the people are suffering. So this big, massive chaos, is happening in Sudan. This one guy is Mahdi, the scholars are refuting him. Some scholars are saying, no, you're wrong, whatever. And then the British are fighting the Anglo-Egyptian wars. The British are fighting all these wars. It comes to a head in 1898 when General Herbert Kitchener at the Battle of Omdurman actually captured what we call the modern day Sudan today. So this is the modern day Sudan. And when Sudan gained independence in 1956, all of these boundaries are actually drawn by the British. And the reason the British did that right, is because they wanted to safeguard their interests in the Red Sea, the Nile, the Suez Canal, and so on. So the entire interest of the British were not the tribal harmony as to, how to put these things together. They just did that to safeguard their interest in Africa. And this became the largest country in Africa, Sudan. Later on, South Sudan, as you know, in 2011 or something, gained independence. But the entire all of this calamity is happening because the British intervention, because of Mahdi, because of tribal warfare that's been going on hundreds of years. So I'm going to now advance a little bit and get into the 80s. So in the 80s, this person right here, Colonel Omar al-Bashir, became the leader of Sudan. Him and this person, Sheikh Hassan al-Turabi, he became, I think he was the speaker of the Sudani National Assembly or something like that. Originally, they both collaborated. Since the independence, by the way, let me take you back to this slide and make one more point. Since the independence of Sudan in 1956 until 2023, today, there's not been peace. There's been one coup after another coup and tribal wars and civil wars and all sorts of things happening because this entire structure, just like what the British did between India and Pakistan, picture Kashmir, right, is just or the border between Pakistan and Afghanistan, which is called the Durand Line, drawn by the British. The reason they did that is because it was part of the Great Game to protect the British Empire, the British India back then against Russia. Completely artificial boundary, chopped up, tribes and families in half just by drawing an arbitrary line. Sudan, this structure of Sudan, which was, done by British, exactly did that. Precipitated ethnic tensions, tribal tensions, all those sort of stuff, right? Now, so what happened is Colonel Omar and Hassan al-Turabi, they collaborated together and they said, we want to help the people out, and they started governing 1989 or 1990, somewhere around that time. This is the time where Bill Clinton, a few years later, Bill Clinton came to power. So Osama bin Laden, he was exiled from Saudi Arabia, and the first place he moved to is Sudan. Now, he had a relationship with Hassan al-Turabi. The Western media, if you look at the articles at the time, or if you were alive in the 1990s, Hassan al-Turabi was banned, or banded about as an extremist, as a militant, as a terrorist, when he was not. Hassan al-Turabi, Sheikh Hassan al-Turabi, rahimahullah ta'ala, his origin is in Tablighi Jamaat. So he was a pacifist to begin with. He was a Sufi, a pacifist. Osama bin Laden was a Muslim. And Osama bin Laden, Sudan, since 1956, has suffered greatly because of economic turmoil, etc. Osama bin Laden had money. He decides to invest it in Sudan by having, different things, bread factories, pharmaceutical factories, all this kind of stuff. Sudan needs the investment. They welcome him. The only thing, between these two people, take a look. Who would Osama bin Laden talk to? He spoke to Sheikh Hassan al-Turabi, and he moved to Sudan, I think around 1992 or something like that. The West at this time is waking up, the 1993, the original bombing of the World Trade Center. Excuse me if I get the year wrong. The original bombing in the World Trade Center. The West links that to Osama bin Laden. Osama bin Laden's living in Sudan. Bill Clinton fires missiles on Sudan. The West begins to portray. So between these two people, this person looks like a practicing Muslim. He has a turban on his head. He has a beard. Sheikh Hassan al-Turabi. The West label him as a Wahhabi. So this was the original, the Wahhabi, the militant, the extremist, the war on terror. This is, and what they do is they try to aid Colonel Omar al-Bashir, who was a corrupt politician. And basically the West aided him to defeat Hassan al-Turabi, who was very, very popular amongst the actual people of Sudan. Osama bin Laden in the late 90s, as you know, leaves Sudan, moves to Afghanistan, but that's a precipitation of what actually happened. For the next decade or so, Colonel Omar al-Bashir continues to rule Sudan with corruption, with an iron fist, doing whatever he wants from the support he gets from the West. And the West's interest at that time was to put pressure on Hassan al-Turabi and on the people of Sudan to kick out Osama bin Laden from Sudan. Then what happens, this hodgepodge of a country which is put together by the British because of their interest On the left hand side here is the area of Darfur. On down here is the South Sudan, right here, South Sudan, which is now independent as of 2011, as I say. A big basket case. If you remember, press writings and opinions of the experts from the 2000s, they were saying that once South Sudan becomes a country, it will become a picture of prosperity. In fact, South Sudan is worse than what it is today. There's a huge humanitarian crisis, etc. Anyway, focusing on Darfur, because this is where the seeds of the conflict, what you see in April 2023, lay. So what happened is there were movements amongst certain tribes here. Sudan Liberation Movement and Justice and Equality Movement, these were basically political representations of those tribes. And what they did is they attacked the government forces and government infrastructure of Sudan in 2003. So these tribes, backed by these political organizations and backed by weapons, and by the way, nobody knows to this day where all these sophisticated weapons are coming from, and I'm going to address that point in a second, attacked the government of Sudan. Now, when you attack a government, any insurgency, like what happened in Pakistan, in the late 2000s and so on, where are all these sophisticated weapons and things coming from? Nobody ever investigates that. Anyway, the government is attacked, so that leaves the government no choice but to somehow retaliate. So Sudan since 1956 hasn't been stable, has limited resources. What do they do at this point when in Darfur tribes are attacking government installations? Let me rewind this and give you a little bit of background and history. Colonel Muammar Gaddafi, he saw himself as a pan-Arab and he wanted to join the Arabs and so on. So he created, or at least supported, some aspects of a pan-Arab tribal militia in the 1980s. So if you look at the map, let me take you back. So if you look at the map, Libya shares a border with Sudan and Egypt and Chad. So he created these militias or supported these militias which would exert Arab identity in Africa. In the 1990s, when Osama bin Laden was there in Sudan, the Sudanese government tolerated these militias. By this time, they were called the Janjaweed. So what happened is when the tribes of Darfur attacked the government forces of Sudan with limited resources, the first thing they did is they asked the Janjaweed to help. They have no choice. The government says, okay, we need to exert our authority or regain control. Okay, let's go and do something. And Janjaweed, meaning these pan-Arab militias, can you help us fight these rebels? And that's how originally the response of the Sudanese government started. Now, when you don't have a professional professional military, which is trained and organized properly, all you have is militias. They strike back, and the militias always strike back, whichever way they can. It's not very organized. They will just do whatever. The world begins to call that the Darfur genocide. And that's where, the world's sanctioned Sudan even more. So our poor country, which has been decimated by political strife, instability, the West's response is to put more sanctions on them. Okay. The response of the tribes who are attacking the Sudanese government becomes more organized, more militant, with heavy weapons, and their factions within them called the Sudanese Revolutionary Front who attack Sudanese government with more ferocity. So can you see the tit for tat? Nobody to this day has done any kind of research with finality as to where are all these weapons coming from. In a tribal society where people are literally living hand to mouth, where are they getting heavy weapons from? So I'm not talking about, just AK-47s. I'm talking about heavy weapons. Where are these heavy weapons being organized, bought, purchased from, etc.? So the government of Sudan has no choice, but they begin to organize these Janjaweeds into some kind of a force. So they organize this as RSF. Bitten by decades, or in fact actually hundreds of years of colonial interference in the affairs of Sudan, they turned to Russia and they said, can you arm this RSF to actually fight the rebels in Darfur. The West continues to make these sanctions harder, continues to say that these are, we need to stamp down on Sudan, etc. So Sudan has no choice but to fight for its own integrity with its limited sources. Russia comes to its help, and this person right here, Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo, he becomes the general of RSF to fight the tribal insurgency. As you can see, one more time from the picture, this is the Darfur region attacking Sudan. Sudan organizes, first asks Janjaweed for help, in a very unorganized manner, which later becomes this RSF. Sudanese army is also trying to fight for its country, but the RSF is specifically organized under the leadership of Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo to fight these rebels. The regular Sudanese army, and I'm now fast forwarding many years, the general of the regular Sudanese army is Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, and the RSF is led by Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo. Now here's the problem. You have a regular Sudanese army and you have an RSF force which has been funded by the government, and so it's also gaining in power, tactics, weapons. So this is always going to be a powder keg kind of situation. In the meantime, the corruption of Colonel Muhammad Umar from 1989 continues. People are suffering. People have had enough. And what the people do is, in 2019, the people of Sudan, civilians, uprise and do a revolt against Colonel Umar. So on one side, you have this guy, who is the Sudanese army. On the other side, you have RSF, which was supported by Colonel Umar. But for some bizarre reason, both of these come together at that time, and they support the civilian uprising. And as a result, Colonel Umar al-Bashir has no choice in the Sudani coup d'etat. He leaves. And a civilian government takes its place. The new Prime Minister of Sudan is a person called Abdullah Hamdok. In 2022, there is another coup d'etat, and this time, both of these again together, Abdul Fattah al-Burhan, Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo, two parts of Sudanese military. One you can call Sudanese army, the other the RSF, again do a coup d'etat and try to kick Abdullah Hamdok out. However, by November 2021, there's a 14-point deal in which they retain Abdullah Hamdok as a prime minister, but the actual power is with this guy, who is the general of the Sudan army, Abdul Fattah al-Burhan. Within a few months, Abdullah Hamdok, the prime minister of Sudan, resigns because he realizes he's a puppet, and it's replaced by Transitional Sovereignty Council of Sudan, which is basically a military front for ruling Sudan. Again, you have two factions, and this is a powder keg situation with Sudan army led by this guy and the RSF led by Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo, and the conflict starts. Sudan is under sanctions. Sudan is made into a pariah by the Western media. They need to look for help. They need to look for investment. In 2020, the Russian foreign minister comes to Sudan, and Russia do a deal with Sudan to say, give us a port in the Red Sea, and in return they said we will support you, provide you with aid, and so on and so forth. The West is completely against it to this day. So you simply Google about the Russian seaport in Sudan, and you will read article upon article about that. Why? Because 40% of the container traffic of the world goes to the Red Sea. So for Russia, this is a very strategic foothold. For Sudan, it is an act of desperation by asking for help because they have sanctions, people are suffering, they need to do something. And that's the only thing they can do. By the way, if you look at the map of the world, as I've pointed out, there are multiple bases by multiple countries: Italy, Spain, in Eritrea, Djibouti, all kinds of places, UK, whatever, even in the Middle East, in Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia. Russia's one base. This sends alarm bells in the West, and they say, no, Russia cannot have this base. This is the point of conflict, which basically, which blew up the powder keg between these two people, Abdul Fattah al-Burhan of Sudanese army and Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo of the RSF. So the Russians helped the RSF develop tactics and weapons and so on and so forth. So they obviously lean and have support towards Russia. Sudanese army, decades ago, because of the war and terror, has a lot of influence from the West. So each group is supporting its own people in Sudan. What the Sudanese army tried to do is, and they say we can't have two different armies in the same country, so let's dissolve the RSF and amalgamate that into Sudanese army, so there will be a single Sudanese army. This person, Muhammad Hamdan Dagalo, he refuses to do that because he has soldiers, he has weapons, he has tactics, and more importantly, he has intelligence, signal intelligence, and from Russia. He decides to redeploy RSF towards the end of March and beginning of April 2023, redeploy. So while the army is trying to dissolve them and absorb them into the army, the RSF redeploys in Sudan, which the army sees as a threat to its own existence. And this is and so right now we are not sure what actually kicked off the violence, what's happened right now between these two. But what's happening is the army is using the air force to bomb these redeployments of RSF, their barracks and their forward deployments, etc. The RSF on the ground is trying to take on the airport, the presidential palace, and the key infrastructure. Between the tussle of these two groups, which are proper army, so these are not militias, they're basically army, hundreds have been killed and over 1,000 have been injured so far while I'm recording this video. What can be done about it? So the first thing, you have two properly armed military, not properly trained, I'm saying armed. There's a difference here. So what can be done? What should happen is the Muslims should have their own NATO kind of force, which should go and become a buffer between the two militaries to actually stop, because the civilians are suffering between all of these. So these are armed militaries but not properly trained, so they're using indiscriminate bombing and shelling and so on and so forth. And however, America greatly influenced. There is such a force in the Islamic world. It's called the Islamic Military Counter-Terrorism Coalition. The name says it all. It has huge influence from America, and is basically designed for the war on terror, for coin operation, meaning counter-insurgency. Although it has the resources, but it's not trained to do that. It's trained to fight counter-insurgency against militias, etc., etc. So that's not really possible. Muslim world has no such force. The only thing that's now left is United Nations. United Nations, Blue Helmets that they're called, when they get deployed, they are not going to go into a war zone where the two militaries are fighting, particularly when this thing is happening in Sudan. By the way, there are racist aspects of it that which you cannot ignore. This is not Ukraine where you have blonde hair, blue-eyed people dying. This is part of Africa where black-skinned people are dying. Whether they're Muslims or Christians, it does not matter. So United Nations is not going to do that. So and this Islamic Military Counter-Terrorism Coalition, which is based in Riyadh, although they have the weaponry, they have the will but not the training and not the authority to be able to do that. That leaves only 3 Muslim countries that can actually do that on its own. Number 1 is Pakistan. They can deploy the military there, but of course they are busy, keeping Imran Khan from power, so that's not going to happen. Next is Turkey. Why? But there's elections coming up, and the Turkey is not in a position to make any decisions at this point. The elections in Turkey are next month. Why Pakistan and why Turkey? Because the Sudanese people have great will, goodwill with regards to these two countries. There's good, solid feedback and review of the Sudanese people, of the current Turkey, and also nostalgic views of the Ottoman Empire. And there's another country which has the military resources to try to become a buffer zone between the two fighting forces on the border with Sudan, which is Egypt. However, Egypt is mired in its own conflict. It's ruled by a military dictator, and it will not be good, to have Egyptian military on the ground in Sudan, although they may have the numbers to be able to do that. So that's the first thing. And when I look hard, left and right, everywhere in the world, I don't see anybody, right, who can do that from an Islamic point of view. And I don't see United Nations, unless something changes drastically, Maybe because Sudan is rich in resources and oil and so on, maybe it can happen, but I am not sure. Once somebody becomes a buffer zone in the between the two fighting fractions in Sudan, then once again we don't need to look to United Nations. Supposedly we have an organization called OIC, Organization of Islamic Countries, that can intervene politically, try to bring this conflict to an end. But as Dr. Israr Ahmad rahimahullah ta'ala used to say, it's not OIC, it's OIC. They don't do anything. During our lifetime, we haven't heard OIC doing anything positive about anything, so that's not going to happen. Unfortunately, the seeds of this conflict lie in racism, colonialism, as to what's happened to this beautiful country, which is also called in Arabic, Baladul Ulama, the land of the ulama. And I don't see anybody with the will. So what you see happening is, the Secretary of State of America and everybody else simply putting out that everybody needs to sit together and resolve the conflict. Well, they haven't been able to resolve the conflict since 1956, and they're not going to be able to resolve the conflict. That's not going to happen. Somebody needs to make them sit down and resolve these issues. And unfortunately, as I'm saying, this needs to come from Muslim countries who have the fear of Allah and the love for their Muslim brothers in Sudan to be able to do that. It is very sad, very tragic that I don't see that happening. I don't see that happening. I don't see where that initiative is going to come from. But we as Muslims, we do not lose hope. We do not lose hope in the mercy of Allah Ta'ala. And I make dua that somehow from somewhere initiative comes where all of this bloodshed and all of this exploitation of this beautiful country and beautiful people ends. And may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bring peace, prosperity and security to this nation of Sudan and its people. Jazakallahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.